Memory, which is central to all cognitive processes, involves both the storage of traces of past experience and the retrieval of that stored information at a later time. It is useful to distinguish between short-term and long-term memory processes. Short-term, or working, memory may be defined as referring to traces available for a maximum of 30 seconds immediately after stimulation, but typically for a much shorter period. The ability to remember a phone number while redialing it is a good example of short-term memory. Long-term memory, or permanent memory, refers to stored information that is potentially available for relatively long periods of time, extending up to a lifetime. Two-year-olds can usually hold in short-term memory only 1 or 2 independent units of information, while 15-year-olds can remember 7 or 8 units, numbers or words, for example. Both children and adults tend to perform much better when they have to recognize than when they have to recall, but this difference is most dramatic in young children. Thus, a 4-year-old child can usually recognize almost all of 12 pictures he has seen, but may be able to recall only 2 or 3 of them. A 10-year-old, by contrast, who recognizes the 12 pictures can also recall as many as 8 of them. Besides improvements in capacity, older children demonstrate an increasing speed of recall and can search their memory for information more quickly. Another improvement in memory ability is selectivity. As they grow older, children become adept at choosing more important items to remember, i.e., at distinguishing fundamental from merely incidental information. In addition, older children acquire more efficient strategies for the coding, rehearsal, and retrieval of information that younger children do not possess. By 8 or 9 years of age, for example, most children know that it is easier to relearn a text passage than to learn it for the first time. Generally, older children are better able to plan their own behavior, formulate problems, monitor their ability, control distraction and anxiety, and evaluate the quality of their cognitive products. And because older children have a more accurate understanding of their own abilities, they are better able to assess and predict the cognitive abilities of other people. Emotional and social development personality traits. Although earlier theorists believed that personality traits evident in the first 3 years of life would persist into later life, research indicates that this claim is exaggerated. Long-term studies that follow children from infancy through adolescence and into adulthood indicate that lasting personality traits do not emerge until after 6 or 7 years of age, and that most of the differences seen in children in the first 3 years of life are not preserved. The one possible exception to this claim holds for the temperamental qualities of inhibited and uninhibited to the unfamiliar. Children who are extremely inhibited or uninhibited in the first 3 years of life are more likely than others to retain those qualities through late childhood. Self-awareness and empathy. Perhaps the most important aspect of children's emotional development is a growing awareness of their own emotional states and the ability to discern and interpret the emotions of others. The last half of the second year is a time when children start becoming aware of their own emotional states, characteristics, abilities, and potential for action. This phenomenon is called self-awareness. 2-year-old children begin to describe their own actions as they are performing them, can recognize a reflection of themselves in the mirror, and may become possessive with their toys for the first time. This growing awareness of and ability to recall one's own emotional states leads to empathy, or the ability to appreciate the feelings and perceptions of others. Young children's dawning awareness of their own potential for action inspires them to try to direct, or otherwise affect, the behavior of others. This change is often accompanied by the urge to test the standards of behavior held by parents, and, as a result, children's second and third years are often called the terrible twos. With age, children acquire the ability to understand the perspective, or point of view, of other people, a development that is closely linked with the empathic sharing of others' emotions. Even 6-year-olds are aware that other people have different perspectives, thoughts, and feelings from their own, and they are able to empathize with the characteristics they observe in others. By 8 to 9 years of age, a child recognizes that people can become aware of others' point of view, and he likewise knows that others can become aware of his own perspective. By 10 years of age, the child can consider a social interaction simultaneously from his own point of view and from that of another person. Owing to this increased awareness, children from age 7 on are more conscious of what others think of them and show more concern over others' opinion of their behavior. Finally, older children understand that a person's genuine emotions can be stronger or different from those he actually reveals, and they thus appreciate that a person can disguise his emotions. One major factor underlying these changes is the child's increasing cognitive sophistication. For example, in order to feel the emotion of guilt, a child must appreciate the fact that he could have inhibited a particular action of his that violated a moral standard. The awareness that one can impose a restraint on one's own behavior requires a certain level of cognitive maturation, and, therefore, the emotion of guilt cannot appear until that competence is attained. A moral sense, empathy, and other forms of social awareness are important in the development of a moral sense. Morality embraces a person's beliefs about the appropriateness or goodness of what he does, thinks, or feels. During the last few months of the second year, children develop an appreciation of right and wrong. These representations are called moral standards. Children show a concern over dirty hands, torn clothes, and broken cups, suggesting that they appreciate that certain events violate adult standards. By age 2, most children display mild distress if they cannot meet standards of behavior imposed by others. After age 2, they will playfully violate rules on acceptable behavior in order to test the validity of that standard. One of the signs of the child's growing morality is the ability to control behavior and the willingness to postpone immediate gratification of a desire. Childhood is thus the time at which moral standards begin to develop in a process that often extends well into adulthood. The American psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg hypothesized that people's development of moral standards passes through stages that can be grouped into 3 moral levels. At the early level, that of pre-conventional moral reasoning, the child uses external and physical events, such as pleasure or pain, as the source for decisions about moral rightness or wrongness. His standards are based strictly on what will avoid punishment or bring pleasure. At the intermediate level, that of conventional moral reasoning, the child or adolescent views moral standards as a way of maintaining the approval of authority figures, chiefly his parents, and acts in accordance with their precepts. Moral standards at this level are held to rest on a positive evaluation of authority, rather than on a simple fear of punishment. At the third level, that of post-conventional moral reasoning, the adult bases his moral standards on principles that he himself has evaluated and that he accepts as inherently valid, regardless of society's opinion. He is aware of the arbitrary, subjective nature of social standards and rules, which he regards as relative rather than absolute in authority. Thus, the bases for justifying moral standards pass from avoidance of punishment to avoidance of adult disapproval and rejection to avoidance of internal guilt and self-recrimination. The person's moral reasoning also moves toward increasingly greater social scope, i.e., including more people and institutions, and greater abstraction, i.e., from reasoning about physical events such as pain or pleasure to reasoning about values, rights, and implicit contracts. This transition from one stage to another is characterized by gradual shifts in the most frequent type of reasoning. Thus, at any given point in life, a person may function at more than one stage at the same time. Different people pass through the stages at varying rates. Finally, different people are likely to reach different levels of moral thinking in their lives, raising the possibility that some people may never reach the later, more abstract stages. Evidence for these theoretical stages comes from children's answers to moral dilemmas verbally presented to them by researchers, rather than their actual behavior in time of conflict. Scientists have argued that many children display a more profound moral understanding than is evident in their responses on such tests. Others have argued that, because even rather young children are capable of showing empathy with the pain of others, the inhibition of aggressive behavior arises from this moral effect, rather than from the mere anticipation of punishment. Some scientists have found that children differ in their individual capacity for empathy, and, therefore, some children are more sensitive to moral prohibitions than others. There is evidence suggesting that temperamentally inhibited children whose parents impose consistent socialization demands on them experience moral effect more intensely than do other children. Self-concept, or identity. One of the most important aspects of a child's emotional development is the formation of his self-concept, or identity, namely, his sense of who he is and what his relation to other people is. The most conspicuous trend in children's growing self-awareness is a shift from concrete physical attributes to more abstract characteristics. This shift is apparent in those characteristics children emphasize when asked to describe themselves. Young children, 4 to 6 years of age, seem to define themselves in terms of such observable characteristics as hair color, height, or their favorite activities. But within a few years, their descriptions of themselves shift to more abstract, internal, or psychological qualities, including their competences and skills relative to those of others. Thus, as children approach adolescence, they tend to increasingly define themselves by the unique and individual quality of their feelings, thoughts, and beliefs rather than simply by external characteristics. One of the earliest and most basic categories of self to emerge during childhood is based on gender and is called sex role identity. Children develop a rudimentary gender identity by age 3, having learned to classify themselves and others as either males or females. They also come to prefer the activities and roles traditionally assigned to their own sex. As early as 2 years of age, most children select toys and activities that fit the sex role stereotypes of their culture, and during the preschool years they begin to select same-sex playmates. Another component of a child's self-concept concerns the racial, ethnic, or religious group of which he is a part. A child who is a member of a distinctive or specific group has usually created a mental category for that group by 5 to 6 years, and children from ethnic minorities tend to be more aware of ethnic differences than are non-minority children. One of the important processes that mediates a child's self-concept is that of identification. This involves the child's incorporation of the characteristics of parents or other persons by adopting their appearance, attitudes, and behavior. Children tend to identify with those persons to whom they are emotionally attached and whom they perceive to be similar to themselves in some way. They seem to identify most strongly with parents who are emotionally warm or who are dominant and powerful. The role models children adopt may have negative as well as positive characteristics, however, and can thus influence children in undesirable as well as beneficial ways. More than 80% of American children have one or more sisters or brothers, and the presence of these siblings can influence a child's personality development. Parents tend to be more involved and attentive toward the firstborn, stimulating him more in the absence of other children, but then expecting and demanding more from him as their oldest child. Because of this, firstborns tend to identify more closely with their parents, conform more closely to their values and expectations, and generally identify more closely with authority than do their younger siblings. Firstborns tend to be more strongly motivated toward school achievement, are more conscientious, more prone to guilt feelings, and less aggressive than those born later. A high proportion of eminent scientists and scholars have been firstborns, perhaps owing to the aforementioned traits, but firstborns also tend to be less receptive to ideas that challenge a popular ideological or theoretical position. Problems in development. An estimated 6–10% of all children develop serious emotional or personality problems at some point. These problems tend to fall into two groups: those characterized by symptoms of extreme anxiety, withdrawal, and fearfulness, on the one hand, and by disobedience, aggression, and destruction of property on the other. The former set is called internalizing. The latter is termed externalizing. As indicated earlier, some fearful, timid, socially withdrawn children inherit a temperamental predisposition to develop this form of behavior. Other children, however, acquire it as a result of a stressful upbringing, experiences, or social circumstances. Sex-linked differences in aggression are evident from about 2 or 3 years of age, with boys being more aggressive than girls. Although young children sometimes fight and quarrel, usually over possessions, such behavior is generally not a serious problem in the first 3 or 4 years of life. Aggressive behavior can become a serious problem in older children, however, and by 7 years of age a small proportion of boys do display an extreme and consistent tendency to be aggressive with others. Children who are highly aggressive by age 7 or 8 tend to remain so later in life. These children are 3 times more likely to have police records as adults than are other children. By age 30, significantly more members of this group had been convicted of criminal behavior, were aggressive with their spouses, and abused or severely punished their own children. Although biological factors can play a role in producing extreme aggression, the role of the child's social environment is critical. Parents' use of extreme levels of physical punishment, imposed inconsistently, is associated with high levels of aggression in children, as are extreme levels of parental permissiveness toward a child's own aggressive acts. Psychologists frequently help parents deal with aggressive children by teaching them to observe what they do and to enforce rules consistently with their children. Parents can thereby learn effective but non-punitive ways of controlling their aggressive children. Although precise information is difficult to obtain, it is estimated that each year about 1 million children in the United States are abused by their parents or other adults. Child abuse is more common in economically disadvantaged families than in affluent ones, but occurs in all social classes, races, and ethnic groups. The abuse of children is often part of a pattern of family violence that is transmitted from parent to child for generations. Children who were abused as infants tend to show much more avoidant, resistant, and non-compliant behavior than do other children. Parents and the socialization of the child. Parental behavior affects the child's personality and that child's likelihood of developing psychological problems. The most important qualities in this regard are whether and how parents communicate their love to a child, the disciplinary techniques they use, and their behavior as role models. There are, of course, cultural and class differences in the socialization values held by parents. In most modern societies, well-educated parents are more concerned with their children's academic achievement and autonomy, and are generally more democratic than are less well-educated parents. No single area of interaction can alone account for parents' influence on a child's behavior and social functioning. One investigator has emphasized 4 factors, however. 1. The degree to which parents try to control the child's behavior. 2. The pressures imposed on the child to perform at high levels of cognitive, social, or emotional development. 3. The clarity of parent-child communications. And, finally, 4. The parent's nurturance of and affection toward the child. Those children who appear to be the most mature and competent tend to have parents who were more affectionate, more supportive, more conscientious, and more committed to their role as parents. These parents were also more controlling and demanded more mature behavior from their children. Although the parents respected their children's independence, they generally held firm positions and provided clear reasons for them. This parental type is termed authoritative. A second class of children consists of those who are moderately self-reliant but somewhat withdrawn. The parents of these children tended to use less rational control and relied more heavily on coercive discipline. These parents were also slightly less affectionate, and they did not encourage the discussion of parental rules. This parental type is termed authoritarian. The least mature children had parents who were lax in discipline and non-controlling but affectionate. They made few demands on the children for mature behavior and allowed them to regulate their own activities as much as possible. This parental type is termed permissive. Specific characteristics in children that have been linked to different parenting styles range from responsible independence and ability to cooperate easily with others to anxiety, distress, and depression. In general, authoritativeness appears to be associated with positive outcomes in children and adolescents, with individuals being confident and able to balance societal demands with their own needs. Authoritarian parenting, on the other hand, is associated with maladaptive features of perfectionism, such as feeling pressured to succeed and being overly self-critical and self-doubting. Research has indicated that parents who pressure their children to excel academically, such as by urging children to earn good grades and by pointing out their mistakes, foster the development of aspects of maladaptive perfectionism. Such children may be at increased risk of developing symptoms of anxiety and depression. The effects of divorce on children appear to be very complicated. The major adverse impact of divorce on children is evident during the first year after the divorce and seems to be a bit more enduring for boys than for girls. Preschool children seem to be most vulnerable to the effect of divorce, and adolescents the least. In most modern industrialized countries, the proportion of working mothers with children under 18 greatly increased in the last few decades of the 20th century, to the point that 1/2 of all mothers with children under 5 were in the workforce. However, there is no clear evidence that this change in Western society had a profound influence on child development, independent of other historical changes during that same period.